You're live.
Hello, my name is Julius Arscott. I'm Vice President of OPSU Local 532, alternate Executive Board Member of OPSU in Toronto Region 5, and I'm a leading member of Socialist Action. Welcome to another in the series of Socialist Action webcasts, now going twice a week, usually on Sunday and Thursday evenings. John Wunderlich, a professional privacy consultant and longtime socialist, will speak for about 20 minutes. After John, we will hear from discussants Basel in Mississauga, Rob McBean in Toronto, and Harry Deng in Vancouver, British Columbia. Following a response from John Wunderlich, we will go to questions from the online audience. If you'd like to participate in that audience, you'll have to access our Q&A feed via YouTube, so check out our YouTube channel. We welcome your questions and we will do our best to answer them. If you like this webcast, please subscribe to Socialist Action YouTube channel. If you agree with what you hear, please join Socialist Action by signing up on our website, www.socialistaction.ca. So, without further ado, we will begin with our featured presenter, John. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Julius. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers and welcoming all of you to the presentation. I'm going to start with a brief background of surveillance, both from a state and a corporate perspective. Then I'll move on to various forms of resistance to surveillance. I'm hoping not to use up all the time that's been allocated to me. It's been my experience that this topic generates lots of questions, and I'm hoping that the participants and the discussants can take it in a direction that we're all going to find interesting. When we talk about resisting surveillance, we need to agree what we mean by surveillance. For our purposes today, I will talk about surveillance as means and methods of gathering information about populations that's been allocated to me, rather than or perhaps including surveilling an individual. States will surveil the population for a variety of reasons. The most obvious and one is a form of state surveillance is the decennial census, which gathers information about the entire population. Similarly, public health authorities and researchers will survey parts of the population to develop public health policies. In the current climate of COVID, we know that has varying degrees of success depending on the country and the surveillance. But the type of surveillance that most of you were thinking about when you saw this presentation is what some have called the neoliberal police state. For example, police and their allies increasingly monitor the activities of social movements and community organizers to head off protests before they begin. And just as police forces are using the so-called soft tactics of kettling instead of confrontation, or moving to non-free speech zones, moving the protesters out of the limelight, they're using the same kind of soft tactics for monitoring social media and online activities to proactively blunt or redirect online organizing and protests. In these activities, state and police actors regularly work with corporate partners. So when you talk about corporate surveillance, most of you will have heard the phrase surveillance capitalism. That phrase was popularized by the work of Shoshana Zuboff, a professor at Harvard Business School. In this context, surveillance capitalism describes a market-driven process where the commodity for sale is your personal data, and the capture and production of this data relies on mass surveillance of the internet. This activity is often carried out by companies that provide us with free online services, such as Google or Facebook. Not surprisingly, this is not a Marxist analysis. It's a critique of a form of capitalist exploitation that Zuboff sees as unacceptable, in the same way that prior generations have seen other forms of exploitation, like child labor, as unacceptable. The problem in this framing is the unacceptable exploitation. The normal workaday exploitation built into capitalism is not challenged. That being said, we owe Zuboff a debt of gratitude for popularizing and publicizing a view of the internet that acts as a counterbalance to the techno-utopian libertarianism of Silicon Valley. But readers of the left press may recall a monthly review a theme issue in 2014 entitled Surveillance Capitalism, well before Zuboff's use of the phrase. The argument for this form of surveillance capitalism is rooted in the development of the U.S. economy after World War II, where the economic planners deliberately sought to maintain and extend the position of the U.S. as the global economic hegemon and lead economic power through mechanisms of surplus absorption. The United States was so productive that it had to figure out ways for that productivity to be kept up as an engine for profit for the leading companies. So the main two elements coming out of that were the creation of the corporate warfare state following the end of the war, which we still have with us today. The U.S. military budget, not even including all the black sites, is, last time I heard, greater than the next 7 military budgets in the globe. And the second element was a massive sales effort and corporate marketing revolution in consumption for the rest of the economy, led by Madison Avenue. If anybody's watched the Mad Men, the television series, that's what we're talking about, which carried the U.S. economy through its golden age, as long as you were white, middle class, and so forth and so on, in the 50s and early 60s. But it ran up against its own limits in the early 70s. So to the warfare state and the sales effort was added financialization. The move off the gold standard, the creation of fiat currency, and the beginning of various debt instruments, and the move of the substantial part of the economy to financial allowed the growth in the rate of profit and overall profit to continue to grow. Foster and McChesney in that article, each of these means of surplus of absorption were to add impetus in different ways to the communications revolution associated with the development of computers, digital technology, and the internet. Each necessitated new forms of surveillance and control. The result was a universalization of surveillance associated with all three areas of militarism, imperialism, security, corporate-based marketing, and the media system, and the world of finance. So the support of the imperial project required an ongoing propaganda campaign that had two messages, two elements: the benevolence of the American project, the shining city on the hill, American exceptionalism. If we intervene, it's necessarily for good. All of that stuff, backed up by heavy surveillance and covert intervention on the periphery of the empire, and on protest at home to forestall competing viewpoints or activities, and so that the cultural hegemonic viewpoint could continue to prevail. So the consumer capitalism that emerged in the 1950s depended on an advertising-dependent media, which has always involved targeting, psychological research, product design, sales, and marketing. The result was the encouragement of high levels of consumer spending and a general lifting of the economy, as workers were conditioned to see themselves as consumers in all their non-working hours, reinforce their dependence on their jobs while feeding the economic juggernaut. So as actual price competition was replaced by monopolistic competition between big brands, the competition for market share required the devotion of media and electronic communications to the concerns of commerce. This explains commercial radio, network television, and as a natural extension of these media, an advertising-funded targeted internet of passive media consumption in support of the financialized, debt-driven consumer economy. And that economy has produced the dot-com bubble of 2000, the 2008 debt crisis, and now the pandemic collapse. The corporate media in all these cases focuses on the triggers, not the root cause, which of course is the capitalist mode of production. So that's the background. When we talk about state and corporate surveillance in 2020, that's the historic background in the political economy in which this occurs. So how do we resist that?
Okay. Thank you, John. Thank you for...
My time's up?
No, keep going. I thought
No,
you were going to go.
now we get into the resistance part.
Good stuff.
We want to provide ourselves, as our families or in our communities or our organizations, some element of privacy and security by pushing back against surveillance. Another way to look at it is to think about the power imbalance between the corporate and state superstructure and the power available to the rest of us. And if we think about it that way, instead of as a technology first problem, we discover that we already know the solution. As individuals, we have to take the necessary precautions to protect ourselves individually, and I'll talk about that. But as members of society or our groups, we have to organize and use our collective power in unions, community organizations, and civil society to push back against the military-industrial surveillance complex. So how do we do that? So if I asked you to protect my house, you might rightfully ask, from what? Am I asking you to defend against burglars or against flooding? Against loud traffic noises or against lightning? In security, we talk about threat models. Since you can't defend against everything, you have to identify what your priorities are and to build and defense or resistance in depth. The threat model for a progressive graduate student in geography or geology whose hopes for a career may well depend on being able to be hired by a corporation or a government ministry is significantly different than the threat model of a middle-aged radical union leader. In the former case, the student will need to be very cautious about her social networking, her engagements, and her web history. In the latter case, the union leader won't care about her social networking profile. She's out there every day declaring who she is, but may be much more concerned about private communications for organizing when she's communicating with people that are trying to organize in a new location. So you need to take a look at your situation and decide what it is you want to protect. So I'll go through a quick list very quickly, just in terms of individual protections. Just if you want to protect yourself, look up virtual private networks. Being able to connect to the internet so that when you connect to a website or a service, they don't necessarily where you're coming from. It also avoids your ISP from spying on you. Use a password manager to manage your passwords, because you don't want to use the same password everywhere. That's a case of easily being able to get pwned or owned. Use ad blockers. Make it more difficult to be profiled and tracked. Mind your social graph. If the product or service is free, then you're the product, right? And just don't click on anything in an email, because 93% of malware, viruses, all that spare, 93% of it, last statistic I heard, the vector by which it got onto your computer was by clicking on an email. But we're here to talk more about how to protect your group. Obviously, every member of a group should follow the rules for individual protection that I just talked about, or use guidelines and self-educate themselves to the extent possible. But for groups, don't use Facebook or any social network if you're concerned about conducting your activities in private, right? Whether you're a support group like AA or a union organizing committee, if you have a desire to control the information shared within the group, then take steps to avoid the surveillance capitalists. The people that organize this, for example, aren't using Zoom, they're using Jitsi, which is an open source technology where they can set up their own server. Now we're sharing it to you through YouTube, which is a Google product, but that's the point, right? You use those tools to communicate out, not to communicate together. It's one thing to have a neighborhood COVID-19 support group. Facebook is more likely to be widely used. It's entirely another thing to use it to try and organize a union. Create separate accounts for the purposes of emails, advertising, or sending out messages for your group so that individuals can't be associated and tracked. If you're responsible for doing the union newsletter or a union organizing newsletter, for God's sake, don't use your own web page. Use a VPN so that the source of those union newsletters that drives the managers crazy can't be traced back to you. There was a case recently of a low-level manager at an Amazon fulfillment facility who took the workers out, but for health reasons, he was fired 3 hours later. Learn how to use encrypted emails or encrypted messaging services. There's one called Signal, which is open source and available and widely respected. There are encrypted email services, and so you take it on yourselves and your group to take appropriate due diligence for within group or between group communications. Again, that's different than when you want to publish out to as many people as possible. You will use you put an ad in the Toronto Star. Doesn't mean you're supporting the Toronto Star. It means that the Toronto Star has a big reach, and that's where you want to reach people. And finally, don't make the mistake of using the tools of surveillance capitalism yourself for your advantage as a group. Does your group's website use Google Analytics? Really? And so forth and so on. So you have to start to think about how, to use that phrase, how your group can become the change that you want to see in the world. So how do we resist more broadly? Well, we already know this. We organize. There are civil society groups as well as NGOs devoted to civil libertarian or progressive views on addressing the aggregation of power by the corporations and the state. Some things to consider. The people that produce technologies are by and large working class. In the course of my job, I'm in a lot of enterprises. I talk to a lot of programmers, marketing people. Most of them are good people, regular people. You don't, just because somebody works for Google doesn't necessarily mean they're a surveillance capitalism. So they're working class, but they don't think of themselves that way. Technology workers don't. Union organizing of the office towers and campuses of the tech giants would be an enormously progressive step forward. When the people who are in those places start to think of themselves as allied not with the Silicon Valley overlords, but with the people to whom they're delivering the services, that's a fundamental change in cultural attitude. Organize campaigns to raise consciousness and push back against surveillance. Name and shame the egregious offenders. Use the tools that regulators make available. Launch privacy complaints publicly against surveillance companies and organize campaigns around those complaints. If somebody in your neighborhood says, let's all buy Ring doorbells so that we can provide community surveillance to the police, and I know there's neighborhoods where that's happening, be the community organizer says, maybe that's not such a good idea. Create alternative technologies and spaces where people are empowered if you have those capabilities. Obviously, this depends on the technical capabilities of your group, but there are open source tools and open source privacy-friendly alternatives to most of the Silicon Valley or Shenzhen-built applications that you use. Your group can be the change you want to see in the world. As we build, organize, and educate around social issues, we now have to learn how to do so in such a way as to build a praxis of digital inclusion. It's no good to say to somebody who's working 12 hours a day at 3 jobs with 2 kids at home, here's a Linux computer, go away and teach yourself how to use Linux while you're doing all that other stuff so that we can be more progressive. That's not a viable solution. And then push your own representatives just politically, including your your union representative, if you're in a union, to explain how data gathering and use, to explain to you how they gather information, whether it's in the union or in your club or in your social group. Explain it to you. And why are you doing that? And what are you doing with my information? It's particularly galling in Canada that political parties are not subject to privacy laws. So I think I've put out a lot of information. I don't know, how am I doing on time, Julius?
You got like 2 minutes left if you want to wrap up.
No, I think that's probably enough to get it started. I'll leave it there and hand it back to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for that very informative presentation and list of tips that activists, whether they be members of Socialist Action or in the labor movement, should consider implementing in their day-to-day work. So I think the next person we're going to go to is Basel. We're going to see Basel in Mississauga.
Hello, my name is Basel Fawal. I work in IT field and I am member of Socialist Action. Of course, to prepare for this, of course, I read the Shoshana. Of course, Shoshana Zuboff, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which opened my eyes. But as John said, it's a different kind of exploitation. It's exploitation of your data. And as you know, capitalism like commodify everything. They take anything in nature or human life and convert it to commodity to be sold in the market. So your personal data become a commodity. Corporates are behind your data, your chats, emails, searches, likes, health records. They are behind actually your behavior. And the danger is that they can influence your behavior. So we saw this happened in Cambridge Analytica to influence people voting choices in the elections. We also saw government add backdoors and encryption weaknesses to devices. So recently we learned about Crypto AG, which is a Swiss company sold encryption devices, but it looked like the CIA have eavesdropped and backdoors and encryption weaknesses in those devices behind the scenes, so it can eavesdrop on adversaries and allies alike, while earning millions of dollars from the sales of this commercial equipment by this Swiss company. Also, we find in the media they portray China that they do surveillance, but as like Edward Snowden, he was reflecting on this, and he said, when I was preparing a presentation on China surveillance, I was looking at a mirror and seeing a reflection of America. So everybody is like all those, doing that, governments and corporates. And as he says, under observation, we act less free, which means we are effectively less free. Of course, sometimes corporates try to justify this, that it will make the products more efficient, or governments that they protect from terrorism or those kind of things. But actually, it's not about that. It's about controlling us. So as he said, that these programs were never about terrorism. They are about economic spying, social control, and diplomatic manipulation. They are about power. So this is what they are manipulating you at the end of the time, and trying to affect your behavior. So this is my intro. I work in IT, and of course, privacy and security is always a big concern in this age of warfare. Actually, it's a cyber warfare between governments, corporates. They are about stealing your data and making you under their influence. So that's a big thing that now in the age of information, or what they call it, the information revolution, in this sense. So I will leave it for you, Julius, for this introduction, and hope it was a brief.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Basil, for your contribution to the discussion. It's always great to hear what folks who work in the field have to deal with. So it's very valuable to us. Thank you. Our next discussant will be Rob McBean in Toronto. Go ahead, Rob.
Thanks, Julius. My name's Rob McBean. I'm a worker here in Toronto. I'm a longtime member of Socialist Action, and I'm also active with a militant reformist group called Acorn. Now, we all know that corporate surveillance is blatant and over the top. Some examples would be retail stores using facial recognition software to catch people who they think are stealing. If they think you took something, they will confirm your identity without ever interacting with you in any way. Then they will send your data after they've confirmed who you are all over the place inside their own retail chain, and maybe even to other stores. This can get you banned from places where you've never even been. This is naturally all done without wasting time on anything like an investigation into whether or not you're actually guilty. The mere suspicion is enough to research your face online, identify you without ever speaking to you, and have you banned from multiple locations at once. Now, this is all done without any sort of chance for people to defend themselves, and often the corporations get it wrong. People have gotten tickets in the mail from stores like Walmart telling them they have to pay $500 to $600 for stealing, based solely on some camera using a facial recognition software to decide that they were in a store at a certain time. Some of these people are innocent. They had rock solid alibis and could prove that they were in a different part of the country when the theft is alleged to have happened. So in a place like a retail store or in the boss's workplace, I guess to some extent we expect to be surveilled. John stated that on private property, we actually don't really have very many rights, not to privacy or to anything else. I think the scariest part about corporate surveillance is when the companies want to take it to the next level and start surveilling us in places where we expect to have some privacy, like in our homes or just walking down the street or going to a public park. The worst offender for this, I believe, is Google. Now, most of us are here in Toronto doing this broadcast. Here in Toronto, Google wants to build something they call Quayside. It's what they term a smart housing development here in Toronto on the waterfront. Some of their initial proposals were just over the top egregious. First, Google wanted to set themselves up kind of like the local government. They wanted to take over some of the functions of government from the city of Toronto. Namely, they wanted jurisdiction over data collection and even property tax collection. They were going to set up something called an urban data trust, where whatever data they were able to scrape out of this new community was going to be their private property. If government or anyone else wanted access to it, they would have to apply to Google for permission. Google also wanted to be the ones collecting property taxes from the community, taking that function away from government as well. Okay, now fortunately, these proposals were shot down. Even pro-corporate cheerleaders who are in love with overpriced private housing development, which are, integrated into the surveillance capitalist state, even they were put off by the idea of Google becoming the government. But it's kind of scary that corporations are even floating these kinds of ideas in the first place. I think it's also very telling. I think it shows the direction where they want to go. Into kind of like a sort of a capitalist dystopia where corporations just simply do away with governments. So I actually have a question for John. How do you think society and government should approach these kinds of smart developments for housing where enhanced data collection and surveillance are embedded into the very fabric of the community?
Thanks, Rob. Thank you very much for providing actually a very thorough description of the situation here in Toronto. I'm going to go next to our member Harry Deng, who's from Vancouver, but I believe is in Montreal right now. Go ahead, Harry.
Hi, everybody. My name is Harry. I'm currently based in Montreal at the moment. So I'm a security analyst for an internet security firm based in Vancouver. So I do a lot of data. But the difference between what I do and what a lot of other people do who work for Google is I have to follow very strict data security protocols, which means I don't have access to a lot of the data that you would use for surveillance. Nevertheless, it's a lot of data. And one thing that I want to touch upon was the idea of data sharing or buying, selling with corporations. And also want to touch upon VPN and the Tor network. So the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of buying and selling data. There tends to be this common belief that the most egregious offenders are companies like Google and Facebook, which they are, very much so. But one thing that people don't necessarily aren't necessarily aware of are ISPs, who are the backbone of what the internet is, and they have pretty much all information on anyone at any given time. So the buying and selling of data does not come from companies like Google and Facebook. They have their own databases, but how your data gets bought and sold and shared is through third-party companies who have access to part of the infrastructure at companies like Google and Facebook, who provide them with data, and in return they receive data from companies like Axiom, now known as I think they're called LiveRap now. But these are the companies who buy and sell data from Google, Facebook, ISPs, and that's essentially how your data gets shared around. But they work in the background because they don't deal with people. They don't deal with people whose data that they're collecting. They work with banks. They work with ISPs, corporations, whatever. So they're not usually known unless there is some sort of huge leak, like, I think it was an American company, I can't remember what they're called, but there was a huge leak a couple years ago where a couple million field data got leaked. But so the second thing I want to talk about was what John talked about earlier, was the VPNs. Now, VPNs are a good option. They're a great option. But the downside to VPNs, two main ones, is one, they usually cost money. And two, they are usually, for the most part, owned by private corporations. And leaks have occurred in the past with VPNs. Now, the alternative is the Tor network, where it's essentially the same idea as a VPN, protecting your IP and encrypting your connections. But it's free. It's based on this idea of decentralization, and so it's a whole bunch of different servers bouncing traffic back and forth. So that's two things I want to talk about. But I think the last thing I'll touch upon for now, if I'm not taking too long,
not at all,
is something I actually read today. I guess the other side of this surveillance is within the workplace. And there was a study done recently where companies like Walmart and Amazon already have technology tracking their workers, and I am tracked at work because every employee's productivity is measured. Now, the poll suggested that around 92% of employees are okay with the idea of surveilling them in the workplace if it increases productivity, which Accenture currently said that surveilled employees have a higher productivity rate of 6%. And so this idea of being accustomed to being surveilled at the workplace may be some sort of, may normalize the idea of being surveilled outside of the work. So I think part of trying to fix the problem is, I guess, starting in the workplace. And John would like to respond. Yes, please. I'm finished, by the way.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Harry. Thanks for your contribution. Another worker who works in IT. It's always valuable to get your insights into what workers are dealing with, and the work that and your insights into privacy. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to a few questions that we've received, and these are questions that are directed to all of the participants. So my first question comes from Barry. How does a quarantine enforcement phone app work? How can people fight Clearview artificial intelligence, facial recognition, and identification technology? Is there a transitional program that connects social resistance to socialist revolution? And the second question that we received is from Jeremiah, who acknowledges that Socialist Action is active and participates and provides a critique of the NDP. Would any of you folks know how the NDP has advocated or not for better privacy laws that will prevent the exploitation of Canadians? And the third question I'd like to pose is, I'm wondering if any of you could comment on cryptocurrency technology, and if you feel that this is any way that people can better protect their privacy in terms of their purchasing power. So I think we'll start with John first. John, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I'll take up a couple of questions that came up in the interventions. First, one thing Rob asked about the approach to smart cities. So I can fold a couple of the responses to the other one by talking about that. Smart city is the idea of using technology to improve the running of a city. So if you put sensors that just count cars and traffic volume in the streets and then provide that information to people in the area, you can then reroute traffic or predict traffic flows. If you there's a whole bunch of non-personally identifiable information collecting that you can do that would facilitate that. There's also talk about building underground deliveries and so forth and so on. The the original proposal by Sidewalk Labs, the subsidiary of Google, was, as Rob said, truly horrifying. But there are cities that are doing much better jobs. Barcelona is doing well, and so forth and so on. So to Barry's point about a transitional program or how to do this, if for example you said, let's not have a civic data trust where everybody who walks through the area, his data is automatically collected and poured into that data trust, which is governed by some board somewhere, presumably with the city's best interests in heart, quote unquote. If instead you use something called a bottom-up data trust, which is, to kind of abuse the historical concept, but the data equivalent of a Soviet, where or a collective or a co-op, where the people who contribute the data to it democratically and collectively decide what can and cannot be done with that data. So that if you are an eco-socialist, your data goes to an eco-socialist data trust. If you're a capitalist who wants to sell their data, you join a different kind of data trust. And so that people are able to express through that way. How does the quarantine enforcement app work? Well, quarantine enforcement is pretty straightforward. You geotag your phone, or in the same way that you would use a bracelet or an anklet if you're a criminal. So if you moved out of a specific geolocated area, alerts would go off and the black helicopters would come out of the sky. The more interesting challenge is with contact tracing apps, which can be done in a way that provides secrecy, but has deeper fundamental programs. How has the NDP advocated for privacy? I have to say that Charlie Angus and a number of the people on the ethics committee in Parliament have been pretty good on this. There's a liberal semi-renegade MP, Nathaniel Erskine Smith here in Toronto, who's also very good. I find on issues of privacy, it's less a left-right divide than it is a divide between those people that think things should be directed from the center in an authoritarian or a top-down or an elitist manner, and those that believe, if you're a liberal in civil liberties, or if you're a socialist in worker autonomy. So I think the divide works along those ways. Cryptocurrency is a variation. It's a technical variation of what used to happen in the 19th century, where people produced private currencies. Every bank produced their own currencies. Stores produced their own currency. It led to wild fluctuations, speculation, irregularities, was a disaster. If you study 18th, 19th century economics, the idea of private banking is not a good one. Plus, the technology, it's the good ones are pseudonymous, but are still trackable. At the end of the day, I don't think it's a fruitful avenue for socialists to pursue. It's much more a techno libertarian, open source, fanatic, individualistic kind of response, in my view. Over to you, Julius.
Great. Thank you, John, for those comments. We're going to go to Harry next. Harry?
I don't have much to add, but I just want to touch upon Barry's question about the quarantine app. So, like John said, it's essentially based on locating you with your phone. So it's using your geo IP information, but also it's also accessing your medical information, a whole bunch of other sources of data, which I guess it goes back to what I was talking about earlier about buying, selling data. Of course, this leads to a whole bunch of issues. Korea, for example, people have been leaking other people's medical information based on fear, I guess. Yeah, scary, to say the least, with this whole quarantine app thing.
I can I can add one thing to that, if I may.
Go ahead, John.
In the HR space, for example, there is software available where the employer, say that you're a construction, you work in construction between multiple sites. There's software out there where an employer can ask or require that you install an application on your smartphone, and instead of clocking in on a device like a time clock or a fob clock, you take a picture of yourself. You take a selfie when you're on the job site, and that tags the geolocation so the employer knows that you're on site and can track to make sure you stay on site because they're tracking your phone. You can imagine the implications.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeez. Okay, so we're going to go over to Basel. And Basel, what are your thoughts on some of the questions that have been posed or any of the comments that have been made? Go ahead.
Absolutely. Of course, not familiar with the quarantine enforcement app, but because we are in the coronavirus pandemic, like there is an app that can work on Bluetooth, so it can record all the people, that can handshake all the people who has the similar app. So if you are infected, they can contact and trace all those people who you met, and they may possibly be as well infected. So of course we saw it here to be able to contain the pandemic, but also it means that it can trace who are you communicating with and whose people you are contacting. And if you are infected, you have to, say I'm infected, so then they know. So all these also privacy. So we saw here the technology has this double sword. It can be used to, contain pandemic, but as well it might be used to, affect your privacy as well. So this is what the German company is saying, to use the Bluetooth technology to contact trace. I would also say that I'm similar with the same boat as about the Bitcoin. Similar like what John said, is that Bitcoin seems that it's not government controlled. So it's like kind of a techno utopia, that it is out of the central banks and those kind of things. But at the same time, we know that money at the end of the time should be tied to some value. It is at the end of the time, it is labor, as per Marxist. The money is just accumulated labor in the past. People work, and then the surplus value is generated, and the money is accumulated. So, and the money then can be used to control others. So money is just a dead labor. It's just the history or the past controlling the future, controlling the present. So if we don't have that socialist perspective, to be able to add value to this money. That this money is generated by just mining some algorithms, and there is no social context to this. So I'm in the same boat as John in regards to seeing it as just a techno, utopia, and it's not. Even though it looks fancy, it looks not under government control. But and of course we saw also the governments, they try to ban it when Facebook tried to release Libra, which is their own currency. The Congress was not actually in favor of that. They still need the money to be under their control. And of course, we saw that during the revolution in Arabic Spring, people start using peer-to-peer networking. So instead of your broadcast, you go to a central server. You can do a mesh network where one person can be the central hub and can broadcast to other people. So sometimes governments try to block you or cut off the internet or cut off the servers that you can connect to. So there is this technology of peer-to-peer networking where a group of people, by their Wi-Fi, they can create a network and they can overcome this internet block from the governments, and their voices can be heard and they can be transmitted as well. So so this is my take on the socialist aspect of technology. It can be used to of course liberate people, and of course for the Clearview artificial intelligence facial recognition, of course it is really dangerous. We need more transparency. I think we need those corporates to be more transparent to governments and to public boards to know what this data is being used. Always this justification that this data is to fight criminals and to be used by the police, or to be used to make your life easier or more efficiency. But at the end of the time, it always misused. So we need more transparency, more governance on those corporates. This is what I think is. So this is, I think, my input on these. I will maybe hand it over to you, Julius.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Basil. So we're going to go over to Rob. Rob, you want to make a few comments?
Yeah, just with regards to the Clearview facial recognition software. If we go back 6 months ago, Clearview was almost unbeatable. It had everybody in its grip, and there wasn't too much you could do about it. Looking forward, although there's some huge complications for Clearview, because all of a sudden now it is socially responsible and acceptable to walk around in a mask. Going forward, if this COVID-19 pandemic continues to have people wearing masks in public, the implications for security in general are enormous, as people will be actually concealing their faces and not setting off any red flags whatsoever.
Okay, thank you, Rob. So I have a couple of more questions. The first one is related to what we just discussed, but I'll read it anyway, from Ellen, and perhaps some of you folks would like to elaborate. So Ellen asks, how accurate is facial recognition technology? What can it be used for at the present time, and where is the technology headed? And Kurt asks, or says, metadata is just as capable of predicting behavior as content-based tracking. So, isn't all data collection dangerous? And I wanted to also ask what you folks think. We're talking about surveillance under capitalism, state surveillance, corporate surveillance. Is there any role? How would technology deal with surveillance under a socialist society? Like how would society operate to protect people's privacy while at the same time reaping the benefits of some of this technology? And this is obviously a very philosophical question, but I'm just wondering what some of you folks think since you work in the field. So I think what I'll do is I'll start with Basel in this round. Go ahead, Basel.
Absolutely. So, of course, this facial recognition is it becomes so smart now. What I need to just say that artificial intelligence is really not. I don't say not that intelligence, but it needs to be trained. You need to have a lot of data, and this data everybody is providing. So those corporates, when they make a profit out of the artificial intelligence and out of the facial recognition, what we have Tesla, they use the self-driving technology. We have all these voice recognition, your home assistant. But those devices, to be able to be to that level, they need always live data. They need because if you need to teach computer to recognize between dog and cat, you need to produce pictures, a lot of pictures, and say this is dog, this is cat. But this is already, people are doing it on Facebook. Oh, see my cat, see my this. So we already producing this data. And now those corporates take this data and feed it to the artificial intelligence and make profit of it. But actually, we are the people who produce this data. So it should not be for profit. Those artificial intelligence, they told us, oh, they've been learned and they've been a lot of technology behind them and a lot of investment. At the end of the time, they need the data. And we are producing the data, and they are just ripping off from us because we always tag the pictures and we always add extra information to the picture, and this will help. So this is at the end of the time, artificial intelligence is very important, but without humans it cannot be at all intelligence. So this is my point in that. Kurt asked, metadata is just capable of predicting behavior as content-based tracking. Is all data collection dangerous? Of course, we saw this big data hype. It's been used all over. The problem that we saw that sometimes insurance industry, they use it to be able to see if you are driving good or bad. Do you do a lot of brakes? Do you do a lot of speed? So then they can lower your insurance premiums based on that. So, but at the same time, you are profiled and you are being tracked, and you are then and your information is shared. Because sometimes what happens is that if you are tagged in some corporate, usually your information is shared with other companies. We don't know what the third parties that can consume this information and use it in not good. So we are going into this kind of totalitarianism where you are monitored everywhere, and your behavior and your data in data banks that all these corporates can access, and you don't know. So now in European Union, they have this GDPR where you can always claim access to your personal data. I'm not sure how really strong is that. But European Union was introducing this GDPR kind of initiative to be able that you own or control your personal data. But at the end of the time, this is economy based on profit, and always they will find workarounds to be able to get profit out of your data. So this is my input on that.
Okay, thank you, Basel. So we're going to go to Rob next. Rob?
I'm going to skip this one. I have some prepared statements, if that's what you want. I don't have anything to say specifically about the questions that were asked.
So why don't we save that for the final closing remarks then? Harry, do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, sure. So regarding Ellen's question about facial recognition, well, it is up and running. It's part of Chinese society now. Now the question is, can it be imported over to North America? we don't necessarily have any laws, regulations surrounding the privacy of the individual, but it's already, at least in the States, I'm not too sure about Canada, but in the States, it's already being used to a certain extent with policing. Now, one of the problems with this idea of data-driven policing, especially in the States, is it's the narrative is that it displaces biases. Now, based on this idea of everything's data-driven, the data doesn't lie. But you got to think about who is putting that data. It's us. It's the people that's inputting the data. So it just reinforces certain racial biases that we have and certain prejudices that we have. So data-driven isn't necessarily also objective, but that's a bit off topic, I guess. But yeah, it's up and running. It's just a question of can it be imported based on our value system and our legal system. Now, the second question about metadata, it was the question is that can it metadata predict behavior climate? Yes. Now, metadata is data about data, right? So for me, my job is looking at a lot of weblogs. That's basically what I do. I look at weblogs, and looking at weblogs, I'm basically just looking at metadata. I don't have access to actual data, right? So for us to be PCI compliant, we can't log things like the body of a request or cookies of the request. So we don't have access to the actual data, but nevertheless, we can use machine learning techniques and use metadata to predict behavior, right? To predict, not only predict, but also see anomalies within this huge pile of metadata. So yes, certainly metadata can be used for the exact same purposes as what of content-based tracking.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay,
that's all I gotta say.
Thank you, Harry. So we're going to go to John before we go to another round of questions. John?
So how accurate is facial identification? Generalize that question to biometric. So whether you're looking at a palm print, an eye print, your odor, your breath, it's as accurate as the data set that goes into training it and the capability of the system that learns it. So it will only get better with time. For example, most of you will have run across something called a CAPTCHA, where it says, "Are you not a robot? Is this identify the pictures that have buses in them," for example. What you're doing is training Google's artificial intelligence to recognize buses. So this stuff only gets better. Metadata, that's a term of art that technologists and database analysts go, I refuse to accept it from the point of view of privacy or digital autonomy. It's information about me. And in fact, if you look at police archives or secret police archives, the Stasi was made available after the collapse of a lot of what the secret police are interested in, a lot of what the Patriot Act was interested in, was who you were connected to. They didn't care what you said. What they wanted to know was what your social network is, what your social graph is. So from the way that we're talking about surveillance, I don't think you should make a distinction between metadata and data. By the way, if you want to find out more about abuses of artificial intelligence, there's a whole raft of books that have come out lately. Algorithms of Oppression, The New Jim Code, Weapons of Mass Destruction are some. So if you email your organizers, I can get that back to you. And surveillance under socialism. I'm sorry, that's kind of like asking what would child labor look like under socialism. The question says, well, we have to have surveillance because we have these technological capabilities. Well, we have all kinds of technological capabilities. Society says, it's not a good idea we do that. So it seems to me that the more appropriate socialist response is, well, why is it that the digital commons is held privately? We have streets that are held common. We have parks. So where's the digital commons? Where's the data commons? So it seems to me a more likely response to that is, well, when under socialism, everyone has secure, anonymous, and private access to the internet, essentially like where Tor is built in, if you will, where tracking and tagging is regarded as a heinous act. What then? What then does the digital commons? What does the digital commons look like when the people control together their digital commons? I think that's where the direction should go. Back to you, Julius.
Okay, thank you, John. So we're going to go to the last round of questions. So I'll read these off. So Barry asks, how can the struggle to nationalize the big telecoms under workers' control help to combat surveillance and commodification? Elizabeth asks, when you use the program WhatsApp and it says encrypted, is your privacy really protected? And we have a comment from Kurt. All major cities have closed circuit camera systems installed. Initiating mass facial recognition surveillance is a matter of initiating the program. And I think that's it. There's a bit of back and forth about WhatsApp. It's a commonly used program, as folks know. So if you want to address those questions and perhaps maybe make any closing remarks, that would be great. So I think that since we're going to be starting with closing remarks, let's start with Rob. Rob?
Yes. Hi. Okay. Actually, my closing remarks very conveniently address the question of WhatsApp. So we'll get to that. It's about 2 or 3 minutes. So I wanted to try to actually help people out a little bit. I wanted to give a little bit of practical advice to help people in their everyday lives, just easy tips and tricks for avoiding malicious surveillance. I want to point out a couple of examples where people had bad outcomes. This was caused by the people not taking data surveillance and hacking seriously. In the 2 cases I'm going to show, both of the outcomes could have been avoided entirely with very, very minimal effort and change in behavior by the people. So the first thing I want to look at is people being targeted for their social media posts, Facebook and Twitter. There are so many examples of this, it's actually somewhat ridiculous. We're at the level now where cops and prosecutors are using people's Facebook and Twitter posts about stuff they've done to get convictions in criminal cases. Activists like us, we get targeted for our use of social media. Our favorite bourgeois Labour Party here in Canada, the NDP, they've got a bit of a history of digging into our old social media posts, looking for stuff they don't like. Sometimes they'll use what they find against the person, typically to deny them to being able to run as a candidate in elections. I have found that posting anything, anywhere, on any platform about Palestine or Israel is just a huge way to get yourself in all kinds of trouble with all kinds of bureaucrats inside and outside the NDP. So it's actually reasonably simple to avoid that. Don't post publicly bragging about, the recent crimes you've committed or about your activism stuff or sometimes even your personal stuff if you think that it can be twisted and used against you. I just want to provide a little bit more of a personal example. I actually had the password to my bank account hacked and stolen from a public computer that I was using. I strongly suspect it was the Toronto Reference Library where I was using the computer. Now, getting someone's bank password or PIN is actually pretty serious business. And again, this was just my own negligence. It seems like just common sense. Don't log into your bank account from the public library. Yet even, so-called supposedly smart people like me, we forget this basic stuff, basic security steps like this all the time. So the bad news is, yes, you are going to be surveilled, and yes, you are going to be hacked. The good news is that, for the most part, protecting yourself is usually just a matter of taking very basic, easy steps to protect yourself. So example, let's say you want to go somewhere and do something, and you don't want there to be a record of it. All you really need to do is just leave the phone at home and then watch out for security cameras. A lot of the time, avoiding state and corporate surveillance can be almost as simple as that. And I just want to wrap up by addressing a couple of myths about digital security, including WhatsApp. First off, there's a belief that iPhones are really, really good for privacy. People think that iMessages are like really, really well encrypted. The encryption is so good that Apple itself cannot even access your messages. Now, that may have been true at one point, but currently iMessages by default are backed up onto an iCloud. This gives you the ability to message from all your different Apple devices, but it also means that that content is stored. And yes, Apple will hand your messages over to the cops if they were served with a court order. So this is pretty easy to fix. Just turn that setting off for your iDevices. So let's get to WhatsApp. There is a myth that WhatsApp has great encryption and is really good for privacy. The encryption is strong, that is a fact, but ever since WhatsApp was bought by Facebook, Facebook started scraping the metadata for strictly profiteering purposes. Once again, if ordered by a court, Facebook/WhatsApp will hand what they have on you over to the cops. And I just wanted to say one little thing about Signal, which John mentioned earlier. Signal Private Messenger, its operation is very similar to WhatsApp. The developers truly have gone the extra mile to protect users' private data. We know this for a fact because they did get hit with a court order to hand over some data to authorities. And the data that they had stored was so minimal that the authorities could do nothing with it. That's all for me.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much for your comments. We're going to go to Basel next. Basel?
Thank you, Julius. I will talk a little bit about the big telecom. I have like some opinion about that, like the infrastructure for telecommunication has already been done. So the telecom industries are ripping off a lot of profit just like for free, because most of the infrastructure, most of the cables, the fiber cables is being run out and this being paid off. So now you are just getting money for free and letting people, of course, pay a lot of, bills on that. We have these streaming and TV and channels that you have to pay for. Now we could see that the telecoms is not only the transmission of the information. They used to be just laying the cable and transmit internet or cable TV or whatever. Now themselves, they also own the broadcasting corporation, and they own the TV shows that you are watching and the series that you are enjoying. So they not only being transmitting, also they own the information, and you have to pay for that. So if you don't have much of a budget, then you are be out of the information. You will be like sided, and you don't have access to a lot of what's happening around you. So I think, yes, big telecoms are really something important in the socialist program to nationalize because of the information and data that they transmit, and of course the profit that they are accumulating about that. So this is, of course, my opinion on that big telecom topic. Of course, cities, of course, we have the smart cities. All major cities has a closed circuit camera, and we have the smart cities program. Of course, it is also another way to, of course, they say that we can turn on and turn off your municipality lights based on the some algorithms, and we can save energy, and we can do this and that. But end of the time, it's also always the justification of the profit and reducing cost. Those smart city will not at the end of the time make your life more social. We are being isolated more and more behind our digital and screens, and we lose this social fabric. So smart cities, yes, they can deliver, they can reduce cost, but at the expense of our social fabric and social life. So I think the socialist community will look more into the social aspect of a human, restore back our human-to-human communication in that manner. My closing comment will be, of course, from security and privacy, as John said, don't use the same password. For your Facebook and Gmail and your bank, don't use, because if one platform is hacked, they cannot access the other ones. So, and if you are afraid of forgetting, try to use some password managers to store those passwords for you, so you don't forget about them. And you can also make them complex password, because you can copy paste them. You don't have to always remember them. And always monitor for any security alert that says this person access your email from another computer or from another location. Make sure you read those messages, because sometimes hacker access your, of course, your accounts, but sometimes you will get alerts. So try to make sure you notice those alerts that, yes, this is legitimate. I logged in from this computer on this day, on this time, in this public library, or no. So try to notice those security. And also many of the free games and the free apps, they are always, there is always not free. So try to consider not to be a lot of installing them, because they might be spyware at the end of the time. Yeah, this is my closing.
Great. Thank you very much, Basil. Okay, we're going to go to Harry next. Harry, do you have any closing comments, or do you want to comment on any of the questions that have been posed?
I guess the only thing I really gotta say is regarding various questions about big telecoms, and I agree with Basil that it's quite imperative if we were to solve this issue of surveillance. It is important for these telecoms to be publicly owned, most because they are sort of the backbone of a lot of data that goes around. I also want to say something else, but I can't remember what I was going to say, so I'll just stop here for now, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much, Harry. And lastly, we'll go to John. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Julius. So I provided some tips. Basil provided some tips, as Rob did, and I think those are all valuable. But I think the fact that people like us that have some knowledge of technology are providing these tips shouldn't disguise the fact that there's a fundamental flaw that we have to provide those tips. The system has built in such a way that we have to take these individual actions, and it's very easy sometimes for people who have some knowledge of technology to blame the victim for not knowing enough technology, where in fact the problem is social and economic, in that we've allowed a system to be built that exploits us in fundamentally new ways. Mm-hmm. And it's more profound than just knowing data about you. They use that data, some of them, and explicitly to modify your behavior, to modify your attitudes, to change who it is you are, to remove or constrain the choices that you see as an individual. There is no more powerful a tool for an authoritarian than apathy, for people to think, I can't do anything. I don't know what to do. It's too complicated. Apathy serves the authoritarian. So yes, take our advice if you can. Find a technology support person, but remember, it's called the attention economy, a phrase coined by, I think, Tim Wu. And the algorithms of the attention economy are designed to suck you in, what they call engagement, to follow YouTube rat holes to the extremes, to get agitated and angry. So your first and best weapon against this is not technology, but it's your awareness and your willingness to fight back and to say, no, I'm not going to be sucked into that rat hole. I'm going to go read a book or get together with friends or look at a different kind of website. Mm-hmm. And the final thing I'd say, I'd return back to the political economy of this. For those of you that some of you will know what I'm talking about, the transition to capitalism was the transition of the economy from a chain where you started with a commodity, you ran it through money to produce another commodity. Commodity, money, commodity. Capitalism flips that outside in so that you start with money, you invest in a commodity to produce more money, which produces the cancerous economic growth pattern we see in all of these things. So it's necessary, but not sufficient for you to individually push back against that. We need to share with our friends, share in our organizations, or join organizations that enable us to think about how we go about establishing a digital commons, how we go about establishing an economy and a society where human needs take precedence over the needs to burn fossil fuels, generate advertising revenue, or otherwise abuse what we were given. Back to you, Julius.
Okay, thank you, John, Basil, Rob, and Harry. Thanks, Kurt, our producer in Mississauga, and to everyone else who participated in tonight's dialogue. Please consider buying a subscription to Socialist Action newspaper. It's only $25 for 1 year, delivered right to your door. You can also visit us at www.socialistaction.ca. That's www.socialistaction.ca. If you'd like to talk to us about joining Socialist Action, you can also call us at 647-728-9143 or 647-986-1917. Once again, if you like this show, please subscribe to this Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next webcast is on Thursday, April 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern. That's this Thursday night. And the topic is Why I Am Running to be President of the USA, featuring Jeff Mackler, Socialist Action U.S. National Secretary, with discussants Kurt Young in Mississauga and Yvonne Hansen in Vancouver. So please stay safe, healthy, and active. Bye for now.